Okay, here we are about to begin our chapter, setting up the actual base textures and textures overall for the exterior hull of our chopper. Right now I'm basically inside of body paint and simply going over my model to inspect and make sure that I have all the pieces that I want visible to be there and available for me to paint on. Body paint basically allows you to paint across multiple objects and seams without any kind of issues or problems usually associated with painting in the 2D application where you don't have that much control. It has the same functionality as Photoshop, but with the 3D aspect built into it. So for this case, basically, I'm going to be using it to, first generate our base texture and to also test out an approach to basically creating worn edges along the actual, contact surfaces of the chopper itself. So right now I'm going to create an 8K texture with a base color pretty much similar to what we see in our concept artwork. It's going to be a bit on the grayer side, but it's still going to have that light blue kind of tealish color to it. And what we're going to do is simply apply that to the model so that we have some type of contrast on which to view the worn edges against. So once we have that created, I'm going to simply go over to the actual material dialog here and create a new layer. And I want to actually go and pick out the galvanized paintbrush that they have, this metallic type of default paintbrush that mimics what you would see underneath an actual painted surface of some type. And I'm basically going to go in there, resize my brush, and begin painting this galvanized material look. Just setting up a few parameters here inside of body paint so that I can have pressure sensitivity as I use my Wacom to make these various strokes and stuff. So I'm testing it out right now. But anyway, I'm gonna go in here and simply resize my brush and just begin painting on all these leading edges. And if you notice, I went into the actual projection mode to do this so that I can ensure that when it does go across a given seam or area that I'm making sure I cover it both, or at least on all sides, and it actually applies it the way I want it to. So basically I'm going to go in here and remove the speck component. I really don't need that at the moment right now. I'm just going down this leading edge of the actual, left side door. For the most part, I'm only going to focus on one half of the entire chopper when I continue this process. But right now what we're doing is we're evaluating whether or not this is a actual viable technique for creating that look. From the looks of it, it appears that it actually very well may be. So what I'm going to do is continue testing it out to see, what types of, looks I can get out of it, and what type of brushes I eventually can apply to it to get other effects and stuff. So all I'm simply doing is going across all the leading edges here. And the reason why, again, is because in real life, it's really hard to find any kind of, perfectly smooth and maintained surface. I mean, maybe in some type of automobile in a showroom or at some kind of exhibition or, any kind of brand new off the production, line type of device or automobile or vehicle may have those kind of surfaces, but for the most part, this thing has been used and abused and worked in, and it should have, some signs of age and wear and tear on it. So what we're trying to do is basically add that type of, element to the overall structure itself. So here I am basically back in body paint again, just looking for an option that I want to use to help, you know, me control the overall look of the chopper. Because in here sometimes you have a situation where the lighting itself doesn't look like it's lining up the way you would want it to. So by accessing the various options, in this case I think the default light, I can change it around to be more suitable to the angle I'm viewing it at. And just simply zooming in and out to inspect what I have so far before I continue painting again. think I'm going to go in there and just move that light around a little bit. As you can see, it changes the actual viewing surface and other angles so that you can, create more of the look that you want without sacrificing, your viewability. So once that's done, I'm just going to go back in there and, continue our testing to see what works and what doesn't. So I'm simply just going back into projection mode here and simply just going across all the surfaces that I believe are contact surfaces where, either there's an interaction between metal on metal or metal with, some type of machine or human actual contact where hands are touching it or rubbing up against it and, manipulating the surface. In this case, we're working around the door handle itself and door latch. So around that area, typically you'll see a lot more wear on those edges than you would other places. So I'm going to add some detail there for that. Just get a rough idea of how it's going to lay out overall. What we're trying to recreate here again is the look of actual painted metal being chipped and worn off of edges and surfaces that come into contact with a lot of objects in various situations, so that we have the appearance of an actual believable surface, one that has some history and actual visible signs of its use and everything. So here we are again, just continuing to paint that process out. And for the most part, you can see how it imparts this, subtle but very, very, readable look of a worn edge. It's not sharp. I mean, and luckily, these particular corners are actually beveled to actually aid in that process. So the highlights and various angles can be caught when I do paint these, worn and rough surfaces. And typically, a model should be constructed in that way so that you enhance its readability overall. And for the most part, since we're trying to attain something that's somewhat hyper-realistic in its approach, we want to keep all those kinds of little details there and make sure that they're basically visible and readily seen across the model, so that it looks and reads as an actual vehicle that could exist in real life. And right now, again, we're just testing out this approach to see how it'll work. But eventually, we'll replace its base, color with our actual working base texture that we'll make in Photoshop, and then basically apply the same technique to it. And for the most part, I'm just manipulating my light here to just change the angles to see how this color shows up and how these edges show up, so that I can make sure I'm going about them the right way. And this is a good idea to continually, analyze and look at your model from various angles and various, perspectives, so that you can see exactly how your texture is working out over the surface. So I'm going to continue back here. I'm going to see what else I can do with this brush to, mimic the effects of this paint being chipped off or worn off. So I'm just going through, testing out different sizes and just, brushing it out here to see how it works out. I'm assuming that the door slides over this area a lot, so it has a lot more directionality to its, overall wear and tear based off of the interaction between it and the door itself. So I'm imagining that these, surfaces in the back of the door are a little bit more worn than other surfaces because of the fact the door is abrasive, somewhat heavy, and depending on its, use, maybe it has gotten a little bit misaligned or doesn't, move as quickly as it should, so it lags and this weight drags across the surface, and you have these abrasive marks that basically get developed over time because of it. And again, this is something that I'm making up on the fly as I paint this, trying to imagine some type of history and story in which to base this texture around. And in general, you have that kind of art direction in production where someone will come up to you and say, well, I want this, this, and that based off of this, this, and that, and it's up to you as the artist to interpret their vision in a way that makes sense while also executing a given job or task. in the case making a believable looking metal. So here we are transitioning to our actual model this time, but this we're going to now load up an actual texture made in Photoshop, and I'm going to simply go into Photoshop right now and open it up to show you, what we're working with. And right now here's our base texture. It's pretty awful green there, but for the most part all I did was take that texture and simply create, a few layers on top of it, and with, various grunge maps to create this, uneven, scratched up, scuffed up surface. So I'm gonna, alter the base color inside the Photoshop document to be slightly more gray, more neutral. I'm gonna zoom in here so you can see actually what's going on as far as, this rough, non-uniform pattern, various scratches and indentations. And I'm going to flatten it out and save it out so that we can load it up into body paint. Now I could have kept all those layers, but I will prefer managing just from, 1 or 2 layers in body paint for the most part, as opposed to 30 layers. Not that it can't be done, but it's because I prefer, having fewer things to worry about. So once we have it loaded here in body paint, I'm going to zoom in on the chopper and see how the texture looks overall. You can see that we have some variation in color. We have some, development of like oil and dirt stains in areas where it should be, and this is by design, of course. And as we go in here to this door area, I'm going to basically make sure that we have our new layer created, have our brush highlighted and picked and ready to go. I'm going to go in there and pretty much repeat the same process we did with the other base texture, but this time over this texture, which is our final base texture of source. And just going to go in here and make sure I have my parameters set the way I want them to be. Just going over, double checking everything and resizing my brush, and here we are testing it out. So it seems to be working out the way I want. So let's go in here and begin painting. And as you'll notice, this actual, galvanized metallic look contrasts nicely with this gray-green, exterior paint base that we have going on right now. And the beauty of it all also is the fact that the texture has already, built-in breakup, so that when these particular, gray metallic scratches manifest themselves, they actually fall in line with other similar but smaller scratches baked into the texture itself. And as you can see, we're basically wearing off this paint in a believable and convincing fashion by simply, putting scratches and lines of abrasive wear, where they should appear. And if you notice, I'm not just drawing straight lines here. I'm actually, fading out some and rounding off others, creating a type of, non-uniform approach to it. And some areas that have sharper, more intense concentrations of wear, where others will have very little or none. And varying that amount of detail over the surface, creates a lot of visual interest, but also some believability in the fact that not all areas will have the same amount of wear, simply because, some areas are going to be in more contact than others by virtue of how the actual vehicle is used, how this door is accessed, whether or not it has been replaced itself, repaired over time, repainted. Thinking about these things and incorporating them into your actual texture helps sell it a lot more. And as you can see right now, I'm simply going in there and just creating the wear that I think will be most convenient for what we're trying to do, but also convincing at the same time. So also I'm using the eraser tool a lot on this as well. Since we have a different layer than our base texture, I'm able to paint the galvanized metal, but also erase away those aspects of it that I don't think look right, or to actually enhance a given, approach. So here we are, basically making the visible scratches and striations in the paint job here, wearing it away. And I'm just looking for those main leading edges that I know come into contact with things. So I'm just going to go through there, give them a rough first pass overall, and just flesh in the general idea of where these scratches are supposed to be, so that later on I have the option of going in there and refining them, sharpening them up, or adding more, elaborate, patterns and techniques to it, but via Photoshop. So here we are, just, going through and just painting these edges, and I'm also saving my scene file periodically. You'll notice a little hourglass pop up and spin. That's simply because I'm pushing a hotkey to save it. I'll try not to do that as much so you can see what I'm doing at all times, but it's a force of habit for the most part, and it's one that most people should develop. At least all that I know should develop, unless you like losing your files and stuff. In any case, just going along here and just painting these worn edges so that they basically make sense and are believable overall. As you can see, it actually, does impart that believability to see that these edges are not perfectly, smooth, but have been worn down and in contact with other objects and things. So I'm just going along this edge and making sure to catch that effect overall. Now the cool thing about this is that since it's a separate layer, later on when we get into making our individual spec maps and such, these types of layers come in handy because you can control the amount of highlight and breakup you receive over the model in a way that makes it more convincing when it's applied to a shader or material. And when you drop that into a nice, lit lighting model or what have you, those areas and surfaces will really pop up the way they're supposed to. So I'm just going through here, making sure I'm saving periodically. And I'm going to just continue, fleshing out these worn areas. So, and also remember that I'm going into the projection mode so that when I do come across a seam or area, that my paintbrush is actually able to go across it flawlessly, and then when it projects it lands exactly where I want it to land and doesn't, follow the actual topology or UVs explicitly, only because, sometimes it will encounter a seam and get caught up on it, and you give you these weird kind of sharp edges that I've noticed at times. And that's just an artifact of how the individual brush calculation is solved in this program. So they had the projection mode to basically alleviate that, so that when you're painting across a surface, it's as if you're making a projection like via a video camera to a screen. I mean, a video projector to a wall or a screen, but in this case from your actual CG camera to the actual 3D surface. And as I rotate, the projection mode basically by default switches back to a painted mode, and applies that given texture or angle the way you want it to look. So again, I'm just going in and painting these edges, making sure that they're worn, they're used, they're visible, and are able to articulate, the fact that this vehicle has been through some, various missions and has some kind of history and life to it. So overall, we're just going to make sure we emphasize that fact. Now, this isn't going to be a extremely abused vehicle by any means. It's just going to be one that's been, worn. So just going through there and making sure these edges are worn down and roughed in, and creating that type of look that we want. And now that we're back here at the back door area of the chopper, I'm going to just continue these other edges, but pretty much start developing those rough, scuffed up scratches from the abrasive contact of the door itself. So for the most part, it's a matter of applying those worn looks to it overall. So I'm just going to catch this angle here and make sure these edges have some wear on them as well. We don't want that many perfect edges and on our chopper here. So I'm just continuing to go in there and paint these really cool worn edge patterns. So again, you also have the ability to change the brush's overall profile by changing the brush type itself, or make your own custom brushes that you can load into body paint to create that look that you want. So again, it's not set in stone to use this particular brush, but for my demonstration purposes, I'm simply going in there and using a very basic, flat brush with little to no opacity. It's all controlled via our pen pressure, and just going in there and just painting our rough edges and making sure it looks as if that surface has been, scuffed up or roughed up by actual, contact. So here I am just going in there and making some broad swatches of wear, and going in and using, the actual eraser tool to refine them. So overall you get a variation of patterns, and I should say wear patterns, and one edges overall. And it just gives you some areas of visual interest that your eye can focus in on and say, okay, that surface looks convincing and believable. But overall, no one area should stand out more than another unless you really want to emphasize that particular area for a given reason. So even though your eye is identifying this as a believable surface because it's able to focus on it, since the entire chopper itself will be treated in this kind of fashion, you know, it should become more uniform and eventually just be accepted as this is a realistic looking object as opposed to some CG thing trying to be realistic kind of thing. And though you can't see it now, it will be more evident in the actual renders to come later on. So here we are, just revealing more of that underlying galvanized type of metal texture from where our paint is being chipped off. And I'm going in there and just treating it with various brush sizes and densities to create some varying edges and wear. So some will be more sharper than others. For the most part, we're just painting it in overall, just more as a guide in rough, but also towards our final treatment as well. But I'm not really too concerned about making it super crisp or super sharp here in body paint, because I can take this later on into Photoshop and enhance it quite a bit in there. So here we are, just inspecting the chopper, making sure we approach any kind of edge as if it's being used or repeatedly abused by some type of vehicle, or just by flying in the air, accumulating dirt and or something that basically bonds to the paint but then gets washed off and then it gets chipped in the process. So that's why that particular little section is brighter than others. But for the most part, it should be pretty straightforward, just going in there and simply finding the edges that you think are main contact points and going in and wearing them down. So just focusing on the back door here, getting some of these angles and edges worked out, varying my technique a bit so that you don't have the same kind of repetitious pattern overall. And I'm distributing these various wears and scratches so that also there's no uniform look at a glance, at least, of this type of texturing. So again, I'm just painting in using my paintbrush, and then in some cases, like right now, using the eraser to go in there and simply erase away some of the excess that I don't need overall. So here we are, just going through all of that, making sure it's the way we want it to look. And so far it appears to be, going in a direction that I want it to go. So I'm just going to go back in there and re-emphasize some of these lines. And again, it's not set in stone how to do this exactly like this or exactly like that. It's just a matter of feeling your texture, feeling your way through the approach you're taking, and seeing how far you can push it, in the given time frame and with the given tool set. And that's another important factor when it concerns texturing, is that you're not sometimes given the luxury of time to create the look that you're basically instructed to create. And you have to sometimes come up with these elaborate cheats in order to fake that particular look, because there's no time to go in there and actually dedicate to painting all the detail that you would want to paint. And in those situations, you have to find some type of mechanism or process to create that look as fast as possible. And in this case, I'm using a galvanized paintbrush to basically represent that underlying texture. Typically what I will be doing is masking out those areas and finding a more suitable texture and later applying it as a general tileable texture in Photoshop that I simply just go in, mask out the parts I don't want to see and enhance the parts I do see so that you now have an extra layer of control that's separate and apart from the actual brushes, profile, in this case a mask, and the actual color values itself from the texture that you're using, and that you can easily swap out and change. So here we go, just going through and making sure we capture those, edges that, should have some type of wear to them. Mostly all these around the door for the most part. Yeah, and just going through and looking, make sure I save my texture here, and just looking at the overall look of this texture and seeing what else we can add to it. I see some cool bevels coming through the form here that may or may not have had interaction with the floor as the chopper lands and descends in various situations. So I think I'll add some wear back here as well. And this wear should be a little bit more directional or directionally based than the other ones, in that this is a kinetic type of wear where the chopper itself has been doing something that is really maybe not designed to do, but for the most part it can endure it, which is basically maybe dragging its tail or this little I guess you can say lower fuselage portion across let's say an aircraft carrier's deck, or landing against a rough terrain and hits a couple rocks. So any of these protruding surfaces will get a lot more wear than others, only because it's like a first line of defense for the actual chopper itself. So here I am just going through, making sure we have those wear patterns the way we want them, just creating these interesting approaches to it. So I may go through a cycle of 10 times just doing a given surface or area until I find a look and shape and composition that works best for my sensibilities here. So it's not a bad thing to erase and paint and erase and paint. It's actually part of the process and searching and finding that given look that you want. So basically I'm gonna go in here and check out a couple reference pieces. And this is our main reference chopper. Just want to look at something here. Overall, okay. And I'm just going through and simply go on there and rough up this edge a little bit more. And again, it's just going through here and making sure that we paint these edges the way we want them to look, because overall it's going to only enhance our texture. And as we build layer upon layer up via body paint and or Photoshop, you'll begin to see this actual chopper take shape, at least in texture form, and become more of a grounded, acceptable, realistic looking, device, as opposed to again a CG model that just exists and it's just there. So here we are, just wearing out these edges that pretty much exist over all the surface of the chopper, and we're going to create these worn patterns, these worn edges, for that purpose, to impart again that this vehicle has been used. It is functional. It's probably really robust and sturdy and can endure a lot of damage, and depending on the situation can take on gunfire even. So we're just showing that this metal has probably experienced those kinds of effects and survived it, and just a matter of going through and just doing it, just making sure you paint those edges and surfaces, and don't be afraid to consult with your art director to get direction about some of those types of things, because typically they have a better idea of what's going on, since they probably are the ones who design what it is you're going to be working on anyway. So to have their input is invaluable, especially when it's time to create these kinds of textures that require a lot of time because of the tedious process of going through, looking at every single edge and inspecting it, and then trying to centralize it for other people to use and access. So by virtue of that alone, you want to make sure that you're saving on time, you're saving on the various number of things you have to manage and control, so that you can focus on your craft and do really good art. And just going in here, adding some directionality to these weird patterns, showing that this thing was dragged across the surface of some type. So here we are, just going in there and painting and erasing and repeating that process over and over again until we build up enough of the look that we want. So here we are, painting here. Just gonna tumble around a little bit to get some better angles here, and just going in there and just painting the abrasive wear of that paint. So looks pretty good. So I'm probably going to erase it back down again though, because I don't want to be too overpowering and too much. You just want to suggest it more than anything, unless it's a blatant attempt to show, okay, this has literally been scraped completely off by some very powerful interaction, and that's it, kind of thing. So here we are, just going through and making sure these edges have their wear, and they all seem to do. So yeah, just go in there and continue painting. And remember how that you can apply this technique to most hard surface situations where you have a painted metal or some type of polished metal that gets worn down or worn away, revealing its underlying unvarnished, or I should say untarnished, surfaces. So yeah, it's just a matter of doing that. So I'm just going along here and making sure to create the worn edges the way they're supposed to appear. Okay, looks pretty cool overall. But again, I'm not going to do both sides of the chopper, just doing those areas where they make contact with one side or another. But for the most part, I'm only going to do the left side of the chopper, and probably some of these rear areas, and even the top possibly, only because they go across the central axis, and it's pretty, I think it's a good idea just to keep those intact as one pass, as opposed to trying to go into Photoshop and find out which object coincides with the bottom versus which object coincides with the top, and trying to paint according to that weird asymmetrical UV layout or something. So in this sense, I combine the two approaches because I know that once I isolate those objects that are not a part of the top and or bottom, that everything else pretty much is up for grabs, and I can do whatever I want with it. So here I am, just making sure to apply those rough edges to the areas where they're supposed to be, and not just generally all over the place kind of thing. So here we are, making sure that happens. Just painting out these brushes here, making sure there's some type of streaking going on. And yeah, let me see here. Okay, looks pretty good. Just gonna go in there and clean it up a little bit more. Again, these are going to be used in our final textures, but they also serve the purpose as a placement or reference in which to enhance it later on from. So don't be afraid if your brushes don't look exactly the way you want them to based on how you're trying to paint them. I mean, because you can easily go back and address those, especially in Photoshop. So here we are over basically the door itself, where one of these, suspension hooks probably, reveals itself and helps out, soldiers, load, mechanical equipment and cargo into its hull. So we're going to basically wear that edge down a lot because maybe there's a type of paneling that's in that area. And you want to basically emphasize that too. So just a good rule of thumb to pay attention to the areas you're painting and making sure they're falling in line with whatever it is you're being asked to do. So here we are, just again going over all the edges that I think come into contact with something and making sure they receive a basic amount, in some cases a fair amount of that look already there. So pretty cool here. And overall, and when I eventually zoom out, you'll begin to see how these worn edges, really do impart an extra layer of believability to the whole process. And it's a really cool look overall. And yes, I'm going to continue painting here, making sure we emphasize the fact that, some type of repeated process is being applied to this area, namely the door opening and closing. So a lot of these worn patterns, so just emphasize that. Okay, here we are, continuing to paint our worn edges here in body paint. Very cool here, just putting in those extra little details, breaking up the surface. I think I'll come down here and add a few. And again, I think the vast majority of these types of effects, will be manipulated later on in Photoshop. But some of them I want to have already fleshed out so that when I look at them in Photoshop, it's not going to be this weird, distorted mess, but pretty uniform and consistent as far as its values and treatment. So I'm just going through and making sure that it's going to follow what the concept has and impart into it anything that the concept did not have. So here we are, just repositioning the light again to get more of the actual surface visible that I'm painting right now, which looks fairly okay. This is basically one of the orbital turret housings, or I should say orbital exhaust housing. So a lot of rotational elements are added here, and I would think that the wear here will be a little bit more than other places because of that. Okay. Just going through here, saving my texture really quick. Don't want it to crash on me. Yeah, it looks pretty good. So just making sure I have the correct brush and parameters set, and I'm going to go through here and actually now begin painting on a new layer some actual dirt that's going to be accumulating across the surface. And right now all I'm going to do is test it out to see how viable it is to do at this moment in time, or if I should just wait to do it all in Photoshop. So we'll see how this works out really quick. Again, I'm just setting up my brush to make sure it's going to do what I want it to do. And if you haven't noticed, I changed the color of the brush itself. Though it is that galvanized metal still, I made it a much darker value so that as it's painted across the surface, it looks like, dirt that's been aged and accumulated over time. So my first pass here is just simply to block it in and go in there and to see how viable it would be in order for us to try approach overall. So just going in, painting some darkness and some dirt. Okay. And actually, I think it may be a good thing to change out this brush. Let me see. It's looking for interesting pattern that has a lot of grit and bite to it, so that when this eventually is applied over, what's going to turn into a spec map, you actually capture some of those highlights and rough areas based off of viewing angles and reflections and stuff. So right now I basically loaded a custom brush that I made in Photoshop and just seeing how it looks. And it's a rather large brush that I created for the most part, but we don't need anything super duper large or high res. Just need something, that's visible enough to indicate, okay, yeah, that this is some type of streaking dirt and not just, some bad coloring job. Yeah, and just going through here and adding it in. But for the most part, I think that I'll get a lot more out of it once I have it in Photoshop. So just going through here, making sure everything is okay. Looking for any additional edges I may have forgotten about that need to be addressed. And it all looks pretty cool so far. Just gonna save this texture out. And here we are, basically back in Maya. I'm just gonna go through here and bring in our mesh. Here it is, just tumbling around, looking at it, inspecting it, making sure it grabbed everything and is showing it the way it's supposed to. And here we are. So I make sure the normals are correct before anything else. Okay. I know it looks a bit confusing, and I should probably go in and, shorten the length of these tangents here. But overall, it's really not necessary because all I wanted to know is if they were facing out or not. So here's our chopper, the exterior portion at least, with the UVs laid out. Again, I try to have them come in and group them according to actual material assignments. But for the most part, it's just, a space saver. So here we are. Let's see here. Hey, I'm just gonna go and make sure we have Mental enabled so that we can come and bake out an actual ambient occlusion pass for our exterior chopper. And that will serve the purpose of identifying areas that are pretty much in close or absolute proximity to each other, and that we're not giving away anything that's considered proprietary or not. So just making sure we name this here. Okay. Just setting up my inventory baking options here, and basically apply it to the model, and it's basically created our map for us with none of them failing. So we're going to take that into Photoshop and apply that ambient occlusion map we just generated from Maya on top of our texture. So here we go here. Okay, here's our AO pass for the most part laid out there, And we're going to use it as our rough guide to making all these textures. Or I should say enhancing the texture of our exterior hull here. And as you can see, it's a fairly decent looking ambient occlusion pass. It has the right amount of contrast and values that I like to work with. Basically now I'm just going to continue looking at this ambient occlusion map just to make sure all the values are the way I want them to be. And overall it looks like it is. So pretty cool. Okay. Just going to open up our UVs here so that I can pretty much mask out the areas that I want to focus on and cut everything else out, you know. So here I am basically dragging my ambient occlusion pass right over, you know, this UV layout, and we're just looking to see how things line up, and so far it seems to be lining up pretty good. So what we're going to do is just, you know, select it all via the magic wand so that, you know, we have this visible marquee, you know, traveling around the entire just process. I don't see here. Okay. Okay, we're just here making various selection marquees around our UVs here for masking purposes pretty soon. Just going over it really quick and looking around. Okay. Let's see here. Okay. Just was masking out a lot of this unnecessary negative space and just focusing on the bits of the AO map that we actually need or want to work with. So once we have that set up the way we want, for the most part, we could begin adding in the actual base texture to our document, or vice versa. Depends on how it's laid out overall. So just gonna go and save this document before I do anything else, really. I don't want to lose anything, and we're gonna simply go in and begin the process of incorporating our painted textures, you know, with this ambient occlusion generated map for the most part. So we'll go back inside body paint here, save the texture out again just to make sure we have the latest and greatest from it, and give it a second to save out so that, you know, we're not violating any processes or anything. And it's done. Let's see here. I'm gonna save another one just for backup purposes. Okay. Just inspecting the wireframe. Let's see here. Okay. Right now, what I've done is create a new layer that I'm using as a way to show directionality on the actual surface. I'm simply drawing a bunch of arrows with the words up beneath them in order to, you know, indicate for myself inside of Photoshop, you know, which end I should be, you know, placing certain things or not. So this very basic, very rough indicator. It's only meant to say, okay, when you are painting in this area in Photoshop, please be reminded that, up is this way, kind of thing, or if the front is this way. So, you know exactly how and where to place, the various textures and techniques so that it's most convincing to what you're trying to recreate. And here we are, just gonna go through and make a whole bunch of these little lines and shapes and triangles. That's all used to indicate pretty much where textures exist and how they should be interacting, with their surroundings. So this will become more evident later on as we get into the grime itself and how it accumulates and where it's built up and all that stuff. So it's pretty straightforward for the most part. Okay. Just going through there, making sure we have a lot of reference lines. The more the merrier. I mean, for the most part, we have a separate layer for that purpose so that when we're inside of Photoshop, we can easily make it visible or invisible depending on what we're doing. Okay. And just going around making sure it lines up. Now, typically in the production, this type of reference lines usually are not provided for you. This is something the individual artist has to determine how to do themselves. If you're going to be painting in a 3D package at all times anyway, it really doesn't matter because you know which direction is the front, the back, up and down, and whatever else. But when you're in a 2D environment with these UVs laid out and they're not really recognizable as this particular shape or that particular shape depending on how it's laid out, then you have no real way of knowing other than going in a viewport of some type and picking the object or labeling each object after the fact, inside of a Photoshop document utilizing a Mentor snapshot or screen grab of the actual, computer itself. So, okay, this is us looking down at the rear of the chopper. Okay, that looks about right to me. I think I may want to add an additional leather texture to my collection here. Okay. Again, I'm just going over the surface, making sure I have it covered the way I want it to. That I always know, that the circled X is basically any faces or objects pointing down, while the rest will be painted according to what these red arrows are saying, which is, for the most part, everything that's, going this way is basically heading towards the top. So, here we are, and if you noticed or not, this approach, for the most part, can easily be done various other ways as well. But again, this is about giving myself extra layers of control so that if I have to edit something or redo an area, it's not over the entire chopper texture necessarily, but that particular layer, and just going in and tweaking it and making sure it's the right consistency along with everything else. So just going through, making sure to have all those little arrows and triangles in the places I want them to be, so that I remember, okay, I know where this red arrow came from, or I know where this particular, reading, comes from. So here we are, just going through and making sure to apply all those to our texture. Let's see. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and save my texture so that we can load it up into Photoshop again. Here's a reference picture of, one of those choppers, by the way, just as a guide of sorts, or inspiration, however you want to interpret it. So just going to go in here and open up our base texture. And as you can see, it pretty much only has those weird worn down edges and streaks, but it's missing a lot of the actual self-shadowing that, in usual situations the lighting will handle perfectly without any kind of, just interaction. But let me see here first before I continue. Just comparing the newer texture with the older one. Okay. Now make that the same as our bathroom gray. Okay. In any case, here, for the most part, since we have, an ambient occlusion pass that pretty much serves as a mask also, we can pretty much drag and drop from one document to another and begin the process of enhancing the overall look of the given objects and components. So what I'm going to do right now is actually that. So, okay. Here's our UVs with the actual reference layer with all the arrows and triangles indicating direction and orientation. And as you can see, the actual underlying AO map, for the most part, is going to impart an extra layer of believability because it's going to have those self-shadowing, areas that we want to enhance in our document. So I just added the whole entire thing, both layers pretty much, to our master, whole texture document. And yeah, it's just a matter of going in there and helping, to create that. Okay. That looks pretty cool. Let's see here. Okay. I'm just going through the document here in Photoshop, making sure it's up to the level I want it to be at. And just gonna go back to and refer to the actual reference artwork to see if I'm forgetting anything or overlooking anything in particular. So it appears to be fine for the most part. Okay. 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 So again, I'm just going through and looking around, making sure that my arrows and upwards are legible. But I'm also filling out the model to see how to accumulate a lot of this dirt and grunge overall. So, okay, just don't be afraid to refer to other concept work that may have been created for you at your disposal, as well as any reference material you gathered from various sources. So, here I am basically taking a texture. I'm gonna pretty much rough it in and see if I can make it, somewhat tileable. Not necessarily perfectly tileable, but just to get the overall idea of, I'm coming in here and going to erase a lot of it away. So if that particular area overlaps, let's say, a visor or something, then it will have to, of course, okay, just going through and cloning out any seams that may have crept up. And overall, it's starting to look like, yes, here. Let me see. Okay. It appears that we were zoomed in on a rather large document, so it's just now a matter of, setting it up so that as we continue, applying this grunge map later, it covers the entire surface. So I'm just going through and making sure all the seams and edges are taken care of. Okay. Looks pretty good so far. I'm using the healing brush, by the way, to make some of those seams invisible. Really powerful tool it is to help, alleviate with that. So, very cool. Okay. So as this particular, grunge map is saved, we're going to continue the process of filling in this entire Photoshop document and just covering up any excess seamage or areas of, just inconsistencies that don't really follow along the look that we want. Then it's just a matter of going in there and either cloning it or painting it out. So just gonna wait for this to be applied. Okay. Now once this tool is finished generating, that overall look, I'm going to simply just go in, duplicate the layer, and erase the excess so that it's a, not seamless texture, because we're not really going to be tiling these necessarily, but overall it's a continuous texture that doesn't rely on a specific group of, peers from your past, but can be asked of, those who, work with you day to day. And just in here. Okay. Let's see here. Okay. So it's just again a matter of taking the grunge maps, or in this case the grunge map that we are making, and basically applying it to the overall base color. And what we're ultimately going to do, and what I'm going to show you, is we're going to utilize the ambient occlusion pass itself as a way to mask out the areas where we want grunge to be and those areas we want to remain or be clean. So it's just a matter of going in there and inspecting it and checking out the actual torch values and stuff. So when we look at this, it actually makes sense. It flows. It doesn't have any gaping, repeatable looking textures, and it actually makes sense because it believes in this, how it's supposed to come out. And I like the clarity and resolution of it. And here we are, just adjusting some of the brightness and contrast of it. See here. Okay. I'm going to do is just drag and drop our grunge that's been color corrected for the most part right onto our objects up here. Let's see. Okay. Okay. Let's see here. Okay, basically just going over the grunge map here. I'm going to be picking out a brush to basically, go over and erase out all the various parts that I don't want to be, visible. in my grunge map. So what we're trying to do is impart some directionality to some of this, surface grime and dirt to appear as if it's been flying through the air or been, through some type of rainstorm or something that, the various soot and dirt and oil stains, accumulate in, the crevices and recesses of the actual chopper, but actually, don't really appear on those, main exposed broad areas where, that kind of dirt would be washed away easily. So right now I'm just, saving out that I should say dirt paths that we just made tileable for the most part. And now I'm just going back into Photoshop here on our main texture document and just creating the individual, variations that we want to see across the different surfaces on the chopper here. So what I'm doing right now is going in and simply erasing away little by little, the grime and dirt until we see the underlying paint bleeding through again. Now, this process is going to be somewhat extensive, but at the same time it's very easy and very straightforward. It's just a matter of going in there and establishing, the individual, streaks and dirt accumulation so that it looks the same overall when you compare it to other areas of the chopper. So for right now, it's just a matter of going in and using your paintbrush here and just erasing. And if you notice, my brush is basically a type of streaky, scratchy surface, and it's just designed to, create that look of directionality that we want. That this particular, vehicle has traveled extensively, has been, used in various missions and stuff. So all this is about is just making sure our dirt and everything line up the way it's supposed to. If you notice again, I have the little red arrows with little up indicators next to it, so that way I can know, which way my grime should be building up and which way it should be eroding away. And in general, if I add any other kind of, texturing detail, which we're going to be doing later on, actually with signage and hardware basically, we're going to use that same reference to indicate exactly where those types of items should go, their overall orientation, and basically, creating, the finished elements for the exterior chopper's texture. So again, just going in here and painting, as you can see, and making sure that the individual sections correspond to the type of wear that they would be exposed to on their day-to-day operation. So right now this is probably the left door panel here in the UV layout, and we're just streaking that up. Here's a feature that I believe appears on top of the helicopter near the rear portion of the engine housing. I'm just streaking that up, and again, it's just a matter of testing it out to see what it looks like. Periodically, what I will do is, flatten out this texture, load it into, body paint or Maya, and take a look at it to see how it's coming along. Or if I'm really, brave, I'll just stay in those applications and just do all the painting and editing there. Mostly body paint, more so than Maya, but for the most part, Photoshop offers me a lot more flexibility because I have a host of brushes already set up for it inside of it, and on top of that I can apply various filter effects that are not readily available inside of body paint, should I ever want to do that. Though it does have a few filter effects, it's not quite as extensive as Photoshop in that regard, not to mention other plugins that I have with Photoshop also. But again, what we're doing right now is pretty straightforward. It's just a matter of going in there and just painting out the grime according to what it should look like. And overall for the shot, it really doesn't matter what really occurs on the back side of the chopper or that right side of the chopper, because we never really see those areas. But overall, I like to just give texture maps that I'm making, regardless of how visible a certain portion of it will be, the same treatment as I would other parts. Now, this doesn't mean that I won't, cut some corners every now and then just to focus on one particular area. But overall, I like to see, that the texture itself is working on most all sides depending on the nature of the model itself. And since we have a complete chopper, it wouldn't hurt to have a complete texture also in that regard. So for the most part, I'm simply going in and just creating, you know, these little streak erasures here on the actual grime and dirt layer that we have created here in Photoshop, and making sure that, you know, it's following the form and ultimately, you know, its own function as far as being, you know, this extra layer of visual interest and giving it, you know, some age and history to it. Again, this is also in part, you know, to help the texture tell a story as far as, you know, what this vehicle is and what purpose it serves, and also to ground it in some type of reality. So again, just go through here and just, you know, paint away. Well, in this case, erase away. And as you notice, I keep rotating the brush manually in Photoshop. I could automate that or just set it up with my tilt feature on my Wacom tablet, but for my purposes now, it's a little easier just to do it that way. Since I didn't set up the Wacom properly for this particular session, I'm just going to utilize, you know, these, you know, rotations inside of Photoshop to do that for me. And if you notice here, I actually have the ambient occlusion map visible still, as was mentioned earlier, and I'm using it as a guide to indicate exactly where these individual recess, you know, sections of the chopper exist, so that as I'm painting, I know exactly where dirt and stuff will ultimately lie. So again, rotating the brush to compensate for the different angles. If you notice that my arrows are pointing up here in this particular section, so my directionality will be perpendicular to that, because the chopper's momentum is usually moving, you know, in a forward axis. So a lot of that dirt will accumulate or streak off the chopper based on that movement. So I'm basically trying to replicate that as simply as possible on the model here, and it appears to be working out pretty decently. Again, we have some more arrows here and triangles visible, which indicate this is a bottom piece, at least in my setup and workflow. And as I go through here and erase away those individual you know, dirt and grime buildup areas, you begin to again reveal a lot of the underlying paint. Now, this approach is, you know, not as complex as it can be. Again, I'm just trying to show the overall, you know, technique of how you can layer on grime and remove it at the same time to build up, you know, interesting values and textures on your surface. And again, this is just for the actual color map itself. We haven't touched the spec, we haven't touched the reflection map. So a lot of this stuff will be, you know, enhanced and actually, you know, brought to be a lot more prominent in those maps. But for now, since we're just trying to establish the overall look of this thing and get at least a good, you know, first pass done, you know, I'm just going in there and roughing in the overall look of how this is supposed to come out in the end. So it would be a lot more refinement to be done later on, of course, but for now this works out pretty well. And just moving around here, making sure I'm touching almost every, you know, piece of surface that we have laid out here in our Photoshop document. So occasionally you'll see me like right now zooming out just to make sure I've touched at least some part of every object here. And you know, for the most part it looks like I have, minus a few little pieces here and there. But again, we're going to come back into this and edit it down later, and then in your own individual projects and time as you're working along, you know, with this DVD, you know, you can do it at your leisure as well. But for the most part, again, this is all pretty straightforward, pretty basic things to set up here. And you know, I'm gonna just save this out really quick, just to prepare it to be seen inside of Body Paint and or Maya, and basically take it from there. So let's see what we have here. Just kind of flatten that out again and save that as a actual texture. I prefer loading those into Body Paint as opposed to a layered PSD, though it accepts those readily, you know, easily. Just want to have a nice flattened one Okay, that is basically another test texture that I am applying the grunge map to, by the way, so that once we have it set up on our model, I wanted to have one with, the ambient occlusion properties already built into it, and another one without it, just to do a comparison and contrast. So for the most part, I'm gonna address that in a second. I just had a little issue with body paint running out of memory here, so I'm gonna restart it and reopen our model here so that we can test out these textures. Okay, and just rescaling the model up in body paint here before I load in my texture to take a look at the overall distribution of grunge across the surface. So as soon as that loads up, I'm going to basically tumble around it, inspect it to see what it looks like. Okay, so here's our model with the actual texture applied to it. I'm not sure if you noticed, but this one doesn't really have any of the ambient occlusion features built into it. It's just a straight color map with our overlying, grunge and worn edges. And for the most part, it looks like it's a bit much. So let me get back here. Okay. Let's see. Let's go back into Photoshop here and actually continue with that approach I mentioned before. So what we're going to do is select all the white components of our ambient occlusion map here. I'm going to go in and just begin deleting out the grunge in those areas so that it reveals only grime and dirt and pockets and crevices where light doesn't really hit as much and where it's had time to basically build up for the most part. And if you look, a lot more now of that green paint is visible. Also the prominent use of the ambient occlusion map itself is also helping that design and look. So here we are. I'm gonna save that out also and load it back up into body paint here. And there we go. And as you look, you can see now it actually is taking the shape it's supposed to. The dirt actually appears to be accumulating in areas where it should accumulate, and overall it has a nice tonality and build up that looks really cool so far. And I'm just going to tumble around here looking at it, seeing what areas I can touch up on and other areas where it's really working well. You actually now have something that it looks like real dirt and stains for the most part being used, and here we know that ultimately it's going to be rendered with a nice set of shaders. So again, this kind of detail in just a basic color map will lend itself perfectly to the type of look that we're going for, only because it's only enhancing the details innately apart into the model itself. We're not creating anything really from scratch to speak of. So in that sense, it's going to be a lot more viable to do all those kinds of things, later on than to focus on them right now. So here we are back in Photoshop again, just going through and making sure that all our, various directional grime is set up, and that no one area is receiving it more than another, except where those cases that you have a lot of deposits being created by, let's say, engine exhaust or heat baking on dirt to surfaces and paint so that they don't really wash off as well. But again, that's all, you know, relative to what it is that you're trying to texture and or make. So here we are. Okay. Let's see here. Just going across the surface here, making sure everything is lining up again the way I want it to. I usually repeat this a lot to make sure I'm not overlooking any areas that should have some type of visual interest, you know, so it's a good idea to just continuously go through and make sure you have those things set up the way you want them to. So once I have the document saved out, for the most part, I can go and just reload it here in Body Paint. Okay. Actually, in the middle here, just decided to create a new map. Let's see here, and what we're gonna set up basically are the little individual, just minor details of additional dirt accumulation. You know, for the most part, what we want to do is indicate where all the little individual, you know, rivets are supposed to be on this model. Since we have rivets on it, you know, it'd be good to show where the dirt has accumulated around them and pretty much, you know, indicate how over time they've been built up. But for now, since our chopper has been scaled up past its original dimension, so what we're going to have to do is just re-import or reopen all this again, but this time together, so that once it's, you know, established, no one has to worry about calling me back, kind of thing. They can just call me directly. So here we are in Body Paint again, setting up our map for actual rivet details. Now that we have our rivet and chopper together at the same scale and size, we're simply going to load it up, you know, with a nice base texture here, making the background color white. And I'm going to use a fairly simple brush with, you know, a black color. And with the pen pressure, it's going to begin tracing out, you know, all these rivet details. Now, for the most part, there's quite a few rivets here to worry about and get set up. So right now I'm just looking for the right brush, you know, with the right type of profile and, you know, pressure sensitivity, so that, you know, we can create these kind of accumulating, streaky, you know, just running type of textures that, you know, they built up over time through various missions, through various climates, and, you know, they have dirt on them now that are just clearly visible with the naked eye. And for the most part, it's just a matter of simply going through and painting every single one with some type of detail and or dirt map to indicate that it is being utilized in this world and being affected by this world and all the various dynamics and forces going on. So what I'm doing is just going through and just adding a little bit of dirt so that that person can at least say I'm a part of this too. And, you know, these textures pretty much work overall to give that impression that this is a real vehicle. And they should do that for the purposes of, you know, making, you know, this entire little short and project, you know, more convincing as a agent or vehicle of storytelling, and not just some elaborate, you know, work of art, basically, without any real purpose. So Here I'm just going through and making sure that I apply dirt to all the rivets. Um, Again, it's not really difficult to do. It's just tedious work because there's so much of them to worry about. But for the most part, once you have, a general idea of how and where your dirt came from and where it's going kind of thing, you can begin focusing your own animal waste to, get this worked out. Okay, so here we are just simply going through and painting these rivets in body paint, ensuring that they are set up the way they're supposed to be set up so that we have some really cool, texturing effects going on. Okay, it's looking pretty good so far. If you notice, I'm painting this dirt as if it was, began running off from around the rivet's edges because maybe it rained one day or the wind itself is so forceful that it's actually blowing the dirt between the rivets out into these directional flows. And others are basically pulled up together and, making just a massive clump of dirt around that, contact point between the rivet and the actual whole surface. So varying those different things in such a way creates a nice visual story as to how and what it is that you painted and what you're looking at. So I'm just going through again, making sure all these individual aspects are covered and that we have the desired look that we want to achieve and accomplish overall. So here we're just setting it up to do that. Looks pretty good so far. Again, just going through to ensure that it's all set up the way I want it to be. A couple of stray streaks there that went a little bit further than they were supposed to. And that only happened simply because I wasn't using the projection mode when I was painting them. So what happened is they just end up continuing along the surface topology following the actual UV layout itself, which is not a bad thing, but because the surfaces are pretty much just disconjointed from each other, those seams do affect how the brush works when you're painting in it. So that should be no big surprise. Anyway, here we are back in Photoshop again. What I want to do is open up, the actual bolt texture that we made inside of body paint that I basically saved out. And I'm going to basically apply this bolt texture to our actual master base texture so that, we now have that rivet detail built into our actual, color map. And eventually this same map will be utilized in also our speck and reflection maps to occlude those surfaces, or at least that part of the surface, from any kind of light interaction of that way. So again, you can see right before we add that to our document what it looked like, and now that it's added to our document what it looks like. And you can see that it imparts another level of complexity and detail that only enhance the way, just how I do textures. So for the most part, this pretty much wraps up what it is that we wanted to accomplish so far, at least in this particular chapter concerning the grunge maps and base texture for the chopper. Overall, it reads pretty well. I like the distribution of the colors here, and the fact that we have, worn edges, we have, grime that's built up and directionally affected by, let's say, wind and water or whatever else, as well as the ability now to integrate a lot more of what we have going on to the chopper, to other aspects of the vehicle, maybe to the interior parts as well. And then lastly, we created these little rivet details where dirt that accumulates beneath, a rivet pocket or whatever other various surfaces, now has dirt that's been built up over time to reflect that. So I hope you've enjoyed this chapter, and I hope that you've gotten a lot out of it and that you can use towards your own individual projects. And hopefully this works out pretty well. So just stay tuned to the next chapter as we continue along painting and making these various texture maps for our chopper here. And hopefully, you can convey a lot of these techniques to other hard surface projects as well. So don't be afraid to experiment and try other things. And actually, I encourage that type of process because it at least develops your, problem solving skills and gives you a challenge in how you approach your textures and such.